Erev Tov to everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. I don't know if you can see me, but just getting the camera on. But I want to thank everyone so much for joining us and thank Rabbi Lieberman for being here for installment number 2 of our very, very enlightening series. We have a special minhag of starting exactly on time. And so we're very privileged to be able to spend every moment that we can learning together. Rabbi Lieberman, please, thank you so much.
Rabbi Posey, thank you so much for everything. And maybe I'll wait 30 seconds as I get my papers together. And let me just see my first screen share. But let's continue our journey. Lecture 2 and then lecture 3. And then with Hashem's help, we'll continue with probably after the Chagim or whenever the schedule will allow it. If with Hashem's help, Beth Jacob is still our achsanya, which I think it will be. Anyway, we discussed a number of interesting theories of why, how, what, and where, and we threw them all out the window. So leaving all that in the past, and we basically only spoke of some Jews in America. What I want to show you for a second is a chart. In fact, I'll show you 2 charts. Look carefully at this chart, and we'll use this chart from here on as a way of understanding what's happening in the United States in this time period, but even subsequently, and we'll need it, and you'll see this chart many times. I find it absolutely fascinating. It's so important sometimes when you study history to be able to conceptualize numbers. So here it is, 1654. The Jewish population in this country, give or take, either way, is roughly about 25 people. Jump roughly about 50 years or thereabout, and you're hitting between 200, 300. And I'm more on the side of about 300. By 1776, which will be a discussion more next week, the number jumps, notice, to at least 2,500, okay, by the higher esteem. By 1790, up to about 3,000. Again, these are like all the possible in-betweens. By the 1800, let's go to 1820, we have 5,000 Jews here in the United States. In the 1820s, there is a minor migration of German Jews, but notice when we get to 1850, which is 1820, 1850, you can do the math, we are roughly 50,000 to 100,000, somewhere in between those numbers. That's German Jews coming here en masse. Why, how, and what? We'll figure it out when we get there. Notice by 1890, we're almost at 500,000. So let me close this for a second and stop the screen share and share a different one with you. Okay, now notice what happens in these subsequent years. We left you off in the 1890s. Notice that by 1900, that's 10 years later, there's over 1 million. 1910, over 2 million. 1920, over 3 million. In the United States today, anybody want to venture a number, a rough number of how many Jews there are in the United States today? Okay, it's something over 5 million Jews in the United States today. Now, the number should be much higher. by that progression, et cetera, et cetera. We'll discuss how and what. Another problem here, especially in our time period today, no census of the Jewish community is ever accurate as far as a census of the entire United States. The way these numbers tally up is by finding numbers of members of any type of Jewish affiliation, and whoever's on that list, boom, gets added into what we call the number of Jews in America, okay? Whether you're Jewish or not, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, religious affiliation is a separate census, and that we have a much better picture a little bit. But again, in the United States, the Reform movement, which is very interesting, not like almost anywhere else in the world to this day. The Reform movement in this country, as far as numbers, is the more powerful in numbers and in a whole bunch of other things, number of Jews in this country. How many Orthodox there are is slightly debatable, but it's roughly in the neighborhood. And again, Orthodox is like the broadest sense of Orthodoxy is about 1 million in the world. Okay, so we're not maybe a drop more, but okay, mi odea. The Orthodox are a small number, obviously increasing tremendously, thank God, to what we call having children, as opposed to some of the other denominations and observance and tradition and heritage and all that. So that tiny number of Jews in this country, we spoke of this Joachim Gans who had come here in the smelting industry, sent, he came, he disappeared. The next Jew that we hear about is a fellow named Elias Legard. Now, Elias Legard shows up here in the 1620s, roughly. We find him in Virginia. Now, he came from France. And again, remember, the colonies here are trying to be established by the French, the Spanish, Swedish, you name it. Everyone's trying to get some colonization going here, the English. And he is sent from France, part of the French idea of colonizing, because France is famous for its wine. And there's a Jew, a religious Jew, Elias Legard, who was an expert at planting the best type of grapes under the best circumstances. There's a fancy word for that. Something with a V. I'm not sure what it is. It's not just like the regular.
Vintner.
No, not a vintner. No. It's more than that.
No?
There's another word. It's a more technical word. Thank you. No, not that. In other words, the first 2 Jews that we actually have records of are Jews who have come here because of some knowledge they possess, which is very interesting. They're not here yet to stay. Of course, Legard ends up staying, ends up leasing land. So you can give him the title of the first Jew on record who doesn't buy, who leases land in Virginia. There's a record that he leased about 100 acres in Virginia. And that's it. His record is there. He stays here, does not return. And we lose sight of him in history. Slightly about the same time, there's another Jew who ends up here, whose name is, let's make sure his first name, I thought it was Shlomo, but then I did Shlomo. Shlomo Franco, who comes from, obviously by his name, he comes from Holland. And his purpose here wasn't really clear. Some say he came from England, okay, wherever he came from, he was a Spanish Jew who helped ship things to this country to establish colonies. They picked on Shlomo Franco, or Solomon Franco, because he had good connections. Now, I'm not about to repeat the story that all of you have heard 1,000 times from me. I'll just give it its title. It's the story about Charlemagne and the elephant. Jewish people to this day are able to travel the world, and in 15 seconds, we do the bageling and we connect to somebody. And sitting on a plane, well, this guy, after the fifth question, we all know someone in common. Spanish Jews, more than anybody else, more than Ashkenazi Jews, literally had connections throughout the world all the time. They were into trading all the time. They traded worldwide. Don't forget, the Radhanites went to China long before Marco Polo did. The idea of knowing exactly who and where what ship is available and who's taking what to where and how is it going here. So here's this fellow who shows up in this country and he's helping ship stuff. The problem is that once he gets here and he ends up somewhere in Boston, it's not very clear who's going to pay him. For some reason, he was pretty sure the Massachusetts Bay Company would pay him, for whom I think he was actually at this point delivering goods. To make a long story short, we only know of him because he ends up in court demanding a fee. He spent all this money. Who knows how much he invested? I'm not even sure. There might be a record of the amount, but he's ruled against, and poor guy does not. In fact, they want him out of here. Okay, put him on the next boat and send him back, or just give him some type of a sustenance or a pitiful amount of money to be able to survive till we find a boat and send him back. Does he go back? Does he not go back? As they say in Hebrew, mi yodea, who knows? But that's the pretty much the few Jews we can find here and there. There's another one that shows up in Boston, another dude, Jonas in Philadelphia, Jonas Aaron. There are Jews here and there. And that's why that number 25 or so is a little bit not clear, because Jews came here. Almost all exclusively, not all, but almost all Spanish, Portuguese, past conversos, who have heard, as we discussed last week, that there's a new world. It is so interesting how, because the Jewish people have been mobile for so long, exile after exile, even in smaller exiles, if they hear of an opportunity somewhere where they can go to, that they haven't been there, or some new business, well, they'll be there. And that has not changed. They'll be out there. Let's go see what it is. If and when we do colonizing of the moon or some planets, as we're now going out into space, you can bet that some fellow out there will be doing the real estate. So, who knows? There's a new world. There's religious person. Who knows what's in this new world? We haven't heard of it. Who rules there? We don't know. Stories. Maybe there are Jews there, as so many people had thought. Let's go to that world. And lo and behold, Jews do arrive. The records are not always the best. In some parts they were, in some parts they were not. So we lose sight. Maybe some came and got killed, some came and who knows exactly what happened to them. Let it go. So let me share with you a different screen for a second. Let me close the numbers. I want you to look at this map and let's discuss it. Okay, you should be seeing it in 1 second. Look at this map. Okay, this is Brazil. Just close my other screen for a second. Notice right here. This is a map of Brazil. Here is the city of Recife. In the larger area, it's known as Pernambuco. Here's Recife. The Jewish community of Recife began roughly in the 1500s. Now look where it is. It's right here on the coast. Okay. Here, by the way, is Suriname, which I'll mention later on. So here is Recife. Okay. Jews have been coming to Recife, which was Brazil, roughly in the early 1500s. And they were basically escaping the Inquisition. The Inquisition had not yet reached Brazil. And they started small communities there, et cetera, et cetera. Eventually, like all good things, they must end, and the Catholic Church reaches out there with the Inquisition, at which point the Jews flee. They flee to Amsterdam, they flee wherever they can. But skipping ahead, in the 1620s roughly, the Dutch, who've had their eye on Brazil for quite a while and some attempts, actually try to make a much serious attempt at conquering at least part of Brazil. And that area of Pernambuco that you've just seen, the Dutch gets to suddenly have, and of course the famous West Indies Company or India Company, depending on which version you're following, want people there. And suddenly Jews in Amsterdam start coming to Recife from Amsterdam. Imagine if I would have had what they call the aerial maps that we have today, like a Google Earth kind of a thing, and I would be able to take an aerial picture of the amount of boats leaving ports in the entire Mediterranean basin and coming out to this part of the world after Columbus and whoever had been here. I wouldn't call it a major traffic jam, but there is quite significant travels. The construction of these boats and hiring people and getting merchandise and let's get going was a great industry of which I know very little except for what I've read. But it's quite fascinating. So here, boats are leaving from Amsterdam, coming all the way out to Brazil. And roughly in the later 1640s, 1650s, we can speak of a very large Jewish community in Recife. Now, they have nothing to worry about. They're under Dutch control. They've come from back home where there was a great Jewish community, of course. I want you to just meet someone. I think I have his. Go with me for a second. Okay. Screen. I don't expect anyone to know who this is. Let me see if his name is there. I don't believe it is. No. Here's an actual portrait of Yitzhak Avuhab de Fonseca, one of the great rabbis who had been in Amsterdam. He was a good friend of Menashe ben Israel. They had studied together. And Yitzhak Avuhab de Fonseca from the famous Avuhab family comes out there to be the rabbi of the Kahal Kadosh Tzur Israel. Now, because they came from Amsterdam, needs of what we call religious implements, a Sefer Torah, books, because by now books have been being published for quite a while. This community was not in want. And Jews come out here. And they invite this rabbi to come out there. In the last couple of years, and I'm not sure anyone's running out to buy it, but they've now issued the third volume of the Kitvei Rabbeinu Yitzchak Avu Abdi Fonseca. And right under it, you can see it, Chachmei Recife, and of course, Amsterdam. Chachmei Recife are the rabbis that end up here. The first time, and I'm not entering the halachic differences, but just the question, of course, makes sense to you. Rav Avuhab, Yitzchak Avu de Fonseca, becomes the first rabbi of a congregation in the Americas, on North and South, of course. He's the first one here. Teaches here, writes books here. He is able to answer a famous question. And he's one of many of the Chachmei Recife who asked the question, when, and the seasons are slightly different there, when should we start to say Morid HaGeshem? Everything's different here. First time it's asked is to the Chachamim in Recife, and about 8 of them piped in. And it's a whole interesting machloket, but not for right now, obviously. And this community flourishes, anything it needs. Within a few months, the message is back in Amsterdam. Whatever they need has been sent over. And the Dutch are very happy to have them. They facilitate a tremendous amount of business. And because they depend so much, it's amazing how much the Dutch depended on all their colonization on Jewish merchants helping along in every way possible. But of course, like all good things, the Portuguese want to reconquer Brazil back for that. And to make a long story short, by 1654, actually there's what we would call a ceasefire. There's an agreement with the Dutch. Okay, we're stopping on one condition. We now rule here. We're letting everyone get out of here, not attacking them. The Jewish community has placed at its disposal by the Portuguese, mind you, 16 boats to take them wherever they desire, and of course take with them whatever they can or desire. Rabbi Avuhab chooses to go back to Amsterdam, and off they go. What is absolutely interesting is that some of those 16 boats that are not going to Amsterdam end up in the foundation of what we call the other early Jewish community in America before we're totally on mainland, and that's the Caribbean. From Trinidad, Tobago, Jamaica, even Suriname lower, whoa, let's go there. And suddenly the 1600, 1654, that entire time period, Jews almost in organized communities, and this will be a very important point I'll come back to, not as individuals, as an organized community. There's enough people from one community with the resources they need to start some kind of a kehillah, some type of a community. By the time they get to build a synagogue and everything else that the Jewish community needs, which I'll discuss in a second, it takes a while. But now, I don't know if many of you who have been faithful fans, it was about 8 years ago, on a Saturday night, Motzoi Shabbat lectures in the winter home. We spent 2 weeks discussing the Caribbean Jewish communities. In case you forgot, one thing you all probably remember, and that's that some of those shuls to this day will have a sandy floor, only because to replicate what they had back in Spain and in Portugal as hiding conversos, moranos, even though no one's happy with that term, we still use it, where on Shabbat, they didn't want to hear that having their noises heard by neighbors, so therefore they basically had sand across the floor. Not to forget that when they came to a new land, they didn't want to let it go. And Al Hayom Hazeh, if you travel the Caribbean and you go through different communities, you'll find them there. Some of the oldest cemeteries within the Americas are found there, and one was found not that long ago. Well, not that long ago, it was like 20 years ago. Totally hidden, no one even knew it existed, but okay. So Jews have gone there, but Recife becomes what we call the very famous place from which one of these boats, with a number of Jews, how many initially no one knows, who has what we call, did you say Tefillah Haderech or not? Well, we probably forgot because this was not a journey that we wanted to take. Definitely not the way it starts out. They leave Recife. And we're not exactly sure, historians argue, but they probably ended up at least in two different places, maybe Jamaica, maybe Cuba. Anyway, they were attacked at sea. A ganze Geschichte, which is sad. 23, some say 27, sometimes 24, but the number 23 pretty much dominates because there's actual names of 23. Might have been more, very possible, but okay, let's work with the number. 23 of these Jews, men, women, and children, end up in what we call mainland USA. And they come to, obviously, the very famous port of New Amsterdam. In September, roughly speaking, not Rosh Hashanah, not far away, 23 of the Jews from Recife end up in what will become, in 1664 or 1665, New York. New York doesn't exist yet. It is now New Amsterdam. And finally, they're able to get off. Now, I don't know how many of you know New York well enough, but at the southern tip, and there are etchings from the 1650s of New Amsterdam. You can go and search for them. You can find them, get an idea of what these ports look like. But if you've been, well, I'll make it simpler. If you've ever taken, and probably very few people have, the Staten Island ferry. Right in that station of where the Staten Island ferry is, at the tip of Manhattan. And that's known as Peter Minuit Plaza. You actually will find, let me share the screen with you, and it's kind of hard to read. I did copy it, so it's a hard time reading. I'll try to make it a drop better. Make my screen a drop brighter. Maybe that will help. Yeah, it looks good actually. Okay. You'll see this right there at the tip of Manhattan. It's well, I'll explain exactly more in a second where it is. You'll find erected by the state of New York to honor the memory of the 23 men, women, and children who landed in September 1654, founded the first Jewish community in North America. So if you ever visit that part of Manhattan, and you can actually see the American Jewish Tercenary, 1654, not even sure what the date is, but it's 300 years later. That's what it is. So it actually stands there. This actual little, it has a flag on top of it. If you imagine Manhattan at the tip, there's a drop more to what we would call the side where the east side of the island starts, and it's right there. This is where the Jews landed. They came right there. What are they to do here? Who do they know here? Well, maybe we'll see in a minute. There are some Jews here, which is a fabulous story unto itself. But lo and behold, basically, because they were held up, at least in two places, and lost some of their passengers, and these were not poor people. They had belongings with them. Well, now they have nothing. Literally nothing. The captain is waiting to get paid as they land, and guess what? They cannot pay him. What are we to do? Well, you all remember our good friend, Peter Stuyvesant, who happens to be sent here by the Dutch to govern this area. And he doesn't really know what to do. Well, basically, he writes back home the following. So let's read this. Let's look at every word because it really becomes interesting. Very important document. Okay, Peter Stuyvesant, Manhattan, okay, to the Amsterdam Chamber of Directors, September 22nd, which I believe was Rosh Hashanah already, but don't hold me to it, of 1654. Listen to what he wrote. The Jews who have arrived would nearly all like to remain here. There are 23 people, men, women, and children. But learning that they, now in nice little parentheses, that they, these Jews, with their customary usury and deceitful trading with Christians, were very repugnant to the inferior magistrates, and also to the people having the most affection for you, the deaconry, of course, the deacons who take care of the poor, also fearing that owing to their present indigence, okay, and now you can see it there, due to the fact they had been captured and robbed, etc., they might become a charge in the coming winter. We have, for the benefit of this weak and new developing place, New Amsterdam and the land in general, deemed it useful. Forget they paid roughly a tiny amount of money. By the way, it was that Peter Minuit who made a deal with the Indians. Deemed it useful to require them in a friendly way to depart, praying also most seriously in this connection for ourselves and also for the general community of your worship, for that deceitful race, such hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of you-know-who, would not be allowed further to infect the trouble of this new colony, in fact, to the detraction of your worship and the dissatisfaction of your worship's most affectionate subject, sign, b'chvodo b'atzmo, Peter Stuyvesant. Okay. In the meantime, let's figure out what to do with you Jews. Let's put them here, let's put them there. The letter, of course, arrives in Amsterdam. And I'm not going to share the screen with you. It's a little bit 3 times the size of Peter Stuyvesant's Sheila. Question, the tshuva came back from Amsterdam. Now imagine for a minute, what do you think the answer would be? It's quite simple. The Jews are an important component of the Dutch society of traders, business, colonization. We want to have Jews in any one of our colonies. And therefore, please, they can stay there and pretty much do what they want. Now, what happens in the interim here is kind of interesting because these 23 Jews don't all stay in New York. Soon, some will move out of here and they'll go to Newport and other places. 3 of them end up staying, and again, by name, maybe there might have been more, but the names, not everyone records everything all the time, but at least 3 make it to the list of what we call the first or the oldest Jewish congregation in North America. And you can actually, believe it or not, again, back to Manhattan. Today is a tour of Manhattan. Go to, see this? It's one of, larger drop. Actually watch, tell me, will anybody know, you might have actually passed by this. Well, what is this? Okay, this is in Manhattan. This is today one of the 3 cemeteries owned by the Spanish Portuguese synagogue. This is the oldest cemetery. And I'll come back to cemeteries in a minute for a very important other reason. And here are buried 3. Now notice the tombstones, they're not, you can see some have moved, some have sunken, some are broken. This is Chatham Square in Manhattan, where the cemetery is still staying today as you see it. It's been slightly restored, but it's a national important shrine almost. It is. And that is because these 3 people, in conjunction with, and here's where it gets a little bit thorny, the records are not that clear. These were all observant Jews. There was very little other option, basically. They had a wonderful kahila back in Recife or back in Amsterdam. Now imagine where they might have been before. These Jews have been traveling literally the world. Their parents might have actually escaped Portugal, grandparents, maybe even Spain. They've hidden, most of them were not openly professing Jews. We're talking about the conversos and the Moranos who were practicing. So the whole different discussion. They've gone to Amsterdam, established a beautiful kehillah there, a Spanish-Portuguese shul in Amsterdam, which I'm sure many of you have visited. Menashe ben Israel's hometown, Yitzhak Fonseca, by the way, in parentheses, Benedict Spinoza came out of this community. Yitzhak Fonseca, by the way, was one of the people who signed on to the cherem against them, but that's a different story. And lo and behold, they're now in New Amsterdam. The Kehillah starts immediately. It's Rosh Hashanah. There's a makeshift community that begins immediately. And eventually they become what is known as anybody's seen, the very famous Sherit Israel shul. It's the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue today, where Rabbi Dr. Meir Soloveitchik, who's an expert at all this, he can tell you all their names, and a fabulous young man, a very talented young man. If you ever see a lecture anywhere that he gives, please do not hesitate to see it. He has spoken on some of these issues, and really it is just quite impressive, really impressive. They start the community. And slowly, at some point, they're small, they get more people, because now people are coming. That's why the numbers on that chart started growing. And they'll go to cities like Newport, Philadelphia, Savannah, Charleston. Charleston. I'll speak of each one of them in a minute. But what I want to share with you is the story of a different person. And he becomes an issue of historical controversy only because we don't really have a clear picture of who he is. Sometimes he is listed or was listed amongst these people who came, except he wasn't really on the list. The very famous, what should I call him? Asher Levi. Now, Asher Levi. Asher Levi is listed as part of people on the boat by some. Today, we know much more about him. An amazing individual who I wish we would know more about, but there are enough records about Asher Levi to form a picture of who he was. Believe it or not, it was what we would call a Polish Yid. We're on pretty solid ground today. He was born in Vilna. Now, if you remember 1648, the Chmielnicki pogroms, he seems to know what's happening and gets out of there. And Asher Levi, somewhere around 1650 or so, comes to Amsterdam. Marries in Amsterdam a woman named Miriam, whose last name was Israel. And this couple somehow are in America when this boat from Recife has landed. They're already here, and today we know pretty much he came in the month of August, came a month earlier. And he came with a different Jew whose name was Yaakov Bar Simon. Now, there's a long thread of points here that I'll collapse into one. The minute 1654 happened out in Recife, the Dutch back home, who had already sent more people to Recife to see how many more Jews should they send there, now hearing that that community is no longer and had been exiled, but wait a second, they've gone somewhere else, is already sending people to Jews. And one of these names is Yaakov Bar Simson, Yaakov Bar Shimshon. Keep his name in mind. Asher Levi and his wife Miriam. They were already here in New York. They had come a month earlier. They had official passport back from home in Amsterdam. Mr. Stuyvesant was not asking any questions about them. These two people are unbelievable in the record that they've left, in the sense that they are the first two, Asher Levi more than Yaakov Bar Shimshon, who every step of the way begin to demand their rights, will go to court for their rights, and if their rights are not met, they're writing back to Holland, who in every single instance, rules with them. Asher Levi stays in New York, and he will be here for when the British come. He dies roughly around 1680. He and his wife become the, what should I call them? The Jews, the couple. I don't want to compare them to like a Chabad Shlichus family that are out somewhere and you go to them for everything, but they will like that, but in more than just giving support to the traditional Jewish way of life, but being able to navigate the system that might be working against you. And Asher Levi realized quite early on that this is a new world. They're not here by toleration. They're not here by some bull of protection. They're not here by some charter of settlement that will expire after a certain amount of years. This is a new land with uncharted territory where everyone, no matter who you are, deserves some rights and full participation in what will become what we call the American way of life. The records show that this Asher Levi, without any training in law, became the lawyer who goes and argues literally across that part of the United States. We'll find him in Philadelphia. He's upstate New York in the area of Albany, where he actually buys land. And he is actually not the first person who leases land. He's the first person who buys land in the United States and rents it out. So the real estate market in the United States can actually be attributed to Asa Levi. He also is the first Jew who buys land in New York City. Somewhere, I believe it's listed as William Street. Now, he gets involved in business and trade. He doesn't get paid, he gets sued. Now, he wanted to be part of the community. He wants to participate. So when suddenly the Dutch are being attacked, he wants to go fight. Peter Stuyvesant is still here. No, you're not going. Jews, I don't think Jews are allowed to fight for us. Well, no, okay. Let's write back to Amsterdam. And he gets his rights. Now, one thing I didn't tell you about Asa Levi is that he was a shochet. Quite interesting, because Spanish Jews almost exclusively, interestingly, even Sephardi Jews in Europe, learned Shechita quite young in life. Part of the reason why the Spanish Jewish community was always able to travel worldwide is they knew how to slaughter animals in a kosher way. But here's an Ashkenazi Jew who has come to this part of the world, and he actually establishes with permission the first kosher slaughterhouse with a license. His license actually read that he is exempt from slaughtering hogs. Talk about religious rights in this country, and like, come on in first, it's Asa Levi, and a whole bunch of other things. He was super well liked by the Jewish community and even by the non-Jewish community. He becomes a wealthy person to the degree where he makes loans. He actually loaned money to the first Lutheran church to be able to build it. And actually, when New York City at some point turned to the wealthy people in New York to help them out for a particular issue, it was Asa Levi who made a donation of 100 florins. So, and his wife. Now, what has survived from them, believe it or not, some besides their names on historical records all across the country, is religious items. Their Kiddush cups in plural, and their Shabbat candles. The actual menorah, if you want, or candlesticks, have actually survived. Kind of interesting, because now that we know more about him and his background, how he got here, years ago when you heard, oh, he was one of the people on the boat, he's Spanish, name Levi always is a giveaway for Spanish Jews. But the small Jewish community in New York, this Shevet Israel, the Spanish Portuguese synagogue, slowly grows. It grows in number. And at some point, they begin to have enough people, like by the 1670s, to go find a place. And throughout their entire, shall I say, history to this day, they moved around from more southern all the way up. Today, they're on West 70th Street, beautiful shul built in 1897, roughly. And they're still there to this day. Very important community in a tremendous amount of ways. Again, like I said, Rabbi Soloveitchik, who is from the Brisk dynasty, is the rabbi of this particular community. Well, you know what? It's not so different than Asa Levi, came from Vilna and definitely helped this community also establish itself. Now, what I want to share with you before I go to some of the other cities, and I owe this to a very important American Jewish historian who is the editor of American Jewish History until he sadly passed away last year. He taught history in general at John Jay College in New York City, but his heart was literally in American Jewish history. He wrote two important books. One, I think, was called A Time for Planting, discussing this entire period and beyond. And a very important book in 1998, which was the definitive book. And maybe we'll discuss it not yet, but when we get to Civil War time, that actually described slave ownership by Jews in an accurate way with records, especially because this became a hot issue in the 90s. And he really did his research, put it out there, so we'll discuss it. He wrote an article. Did I say Farber? My mistake, Faber. Eli Faber. Eli Faber wrote an article a number of years ago called Preservation and Innovation. And he was describing the religious part of the early American Jewish community. And he had 4 steps. So here are his 4 steps, with my little additions here and there, but overall, I have to give him credit. Almost all Jewish communities that arrive in New York are first, there's a small number of arrivals. They can't have a community yet. Now think for a minute. You want to establish a Jewish community. What are essential to a Jewish community? What makes a kehillah? Okay, you need people. You need a central area of worship. You need a shul. You need rabbinic leadership. You need education. You need a mohel. You need a mikvah. And I said that I would come back to cemeteries. Eli Faber's second step, and it is without fail in all Jewish communities, even with Sheeret Israel and Newport, Philadelphia, Savannah, Charleston. First small, maybe they came in a larger group and were able to start quicker, but right away, a shul. Let's find, if not a rabbi, a chazan, at least a Torah reader. Let's find somebody. And their second step, once they have a kehillah, or actually their first step as a group, is to buy a cemetery. Before you build a shul, before you build a school, they all bought cemeteries. Sheeret Israel did the same thing, bought a cemetery. You saw the Chatham Square one. They bought that long before they had a shul. Every Jewish community did that. And that's an interesting lecture about the Jewish cemeteries in colonial period. Now, prayer services, step 3 in the initial period when there are few, is in homes. All of them. Same thing happened here. Now, especially when that first group came, while they could not establish anything in the open, Peter Stuyvesant did give them permission to pray as a group in a private home, which is what they did. And only after that, they begin to build a synagogue. Now, the beauty of this 4th step is that, like, you can always trace it, except in situations where what you have is what we call an established Jewish community arriving in one shot, which does happen too. Move to Newport. And I don't want to spend too much time in Newport because I assume everyone has been to the Torah synagogue and seen it. It is the oldest shul in North America. That's still being used, by the way. I'm sure all of you remember Beth Jacob, Rabbi Mendel from Beth Jacob, who's the rabbi there today. And maybe you've toured it and he's given you a tour and shown you even some of the Sifrei Torah, very famous one that had been sent to New York, to Newport. Sheeret Israel and Torah synagogues are all cousins, brothers, families. Okay, they were fighting about this Torah later on in history, who actually owns it, but okay. I'm not getting into Jewish fights. In parentheses, even on the boat of 23 who arrived from Recife, there was a woman, Raquel Nunez, or Ricky Nunez, as she's known in history books, who actually sues one of the passengers for money that he owed her from even before the trip. So put a bunch of Jews on a boat, someone's going to sue someone, and that's part of our beautiful traditions. Now, the other things that these communities end up doing is the laws of kashrut are not controlled by free enterprise. Kids say, oh, I'm going into the business. Even Asa Levi works together with the Kehillah in New York, okay? Wherever in Newport, kashrut becomes, now in America, how do you enforce laws? So every one of these shuls in Newport, Torah Synagogue, in Philadelphia, the Mikveh Israel, again, that title that keeps on coming up. All these, by the way, established by Spanish Jews. The one in Savannah, okay, if you have nothing to do and you want to read a great book, Third to None, the saga of the Jews of Savannah. Notice the date, 1733. 40-some people leave London. London, you say? I thought there were no Jews in London. Well, Menashe ben Israel, Cromwell, 1655, Jews were coming back to England. By the year 1700, there are 6,000 Jews in London. Some are doing very well. Some are very poor. So the wealthy, imagine this, don't want to just give charity to this poor part of the Jews of London. Again, 6,000 Jews in such a short time. There's an opportunity to start a colony in this new world. Well, whoever wants to go, we'll pay. We'll even help Oglethorpe, if you remember that colonization, that comes to Savannah. So Jews from London, now they came equipped with the Sefer Torah, with it all. They land in Savannah. And slowly, the year they land, they left around February, about 5 months. By June, they're in Savannah. Not everyone's happy about the Jews being there. And I mean, there's also a great story. Oglethorpe writes back. By the time the answer comes back, the Jews have already established a community in America, as they say in Yiddish, leave me alone. And they're on their own. And soon they buy land for cemetery, start their own kashrut with communal laws, and there's Savannah. It repeats itself in Philadelphia with the Mikveh Israel synagogue, also to this day, still operational. I don't think it has a minyan during the week. It might, but Shabbat, Chagim, there's a minyan there. Also moved around, but it has historical status as one of the older congregations of the United States, and the same thing happens in Charleston. Charleston is interesting because part of it was the Spanish at some point actually attacked Savannah. And when the Jews hear Spanish, oh my gosh, the people with the Inquisition are coming, they're running. They came to Charleston, started a community, it became one of the largest communities quite quickly. So these places become, within the short time period, Philadelphia, quite important. We'll come back to Philadelphia next week. We'll come back to all of them next week, actually, because next week I want to discuss 1776 and the reaction of the Jews, which is quite interesting, to the American Revolution, and where most of them stood and where some stood, and how that played out. But all of it will relate to this first arrival and then the influx of all this. Call them refugees, call them immigrants, call them new arrivals, almost exclusively of what we call Spanish, Portuguese, Sephardi. In Savannah, though, because they came from London, amongst the 40-some people who are on that boat, there were 8 Ashkenazim. And I'll read more about them to you next week. But Ashkenazim are suddenly coming in. And I almost said that with a drop of disdain, because when I'll read you a description. I'll leave you like hanging because I see we're almost out of time. And we'll start with that next week. The description of the Ashkenazi Jews in Savannah. So thank you so much for joining us. Bezrat Hashem next week. And all the best. By the way, if you do have any questions, I ignored the chat last week. If somebody did post something, thank you. But if you have a quick question, I see there's like 30 seconds left. Everybody, if not, have an amazing, easy, meaningful fast, and we should all be zochet to meet in Yerushalayim Yer HaKodesh. And that'll be a different lecture, everybody. So Hashem should be with everybody. And again, thank you so much for your time. And Beth Jacob, thank you. And of course, in Winter for all that you always do. Thank you so much. Be well.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Be well.
Easy fast.
You too. Well, thanks for sending those articles, Sue. Thank you so much. Thanks.
So enjoyable. Thank you so much. So interesting and well said. I just loved it.
Thank you so much. Be well. Good
You
night,
too.
everyone.
Thank you.
You're welcome.